What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're living up to our moniker by talking some Warhammer 40k tactics. The secondary mission system in 10th edition 40k is brand new and brings a really interesting interaction between both fixed and tactical secondary missions, giving players the option to either draw randomly from a deck or play a fixed set of missions, but obviously opens up a whole new arena of strategy that you can bring to your games of Warhammer 40k. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between these two modes of secondary mission scoring, which one you should use, when you should use fixed versus tactical secondaries, and the best way to make the most of each one of these methods of scoring. As always, if you're enjoying my Warhammer 40k 10th edition coverage, please let me know down in the comment section down below. Drop a like in the video, subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff. You know what's up, and let's talk about the mission stuff. Now, first off, some basic information. In Leviathan games of 10th edition Warhammer 40k, you have two ways to score: your primary mission and your secondary mission. The primary mission deals mostly with the objectives on the table, literal objective markers that your units will have to go control and score off of. The secondary missions, however, are different depending on whether you choose fixed or tactical secondaries, and both of them require you to go above and beyond to complete specific tasks, either holding specific areas of the table or objective markers, destroying particular enemy units, or performing actions on the table. As a little bit of an aside, these used to be called secondary objectives in 9th edition, and so I'm definitely going to slip up and call them that sometime in this video, if not for the entirety of the video, so fair warning on that. I mean secondary missions if I say secondary objectives. I'm not referring to objective markers or anything. Likewise, a lot of these secondary missions require you to sacrifice the rest of a unit's turn in order to do something. I'm going to refer to these as actions because that was the name of the mechanic in 9th edition, and it's basically identical in 10th. Now, once you know what your primary mission and the deployment of the game is, you'll begin the game by choosing either fixed missions, in which case you'll choose two out of a short list of missions that you can complete, or tactical missions. While fixed missions are straightforward, tactical missions are random from turn to turn and a little bit more complicated, but consequently pretty powerful. If you choose tactical missions at the start of your command phase, you'll draw 2 cards from the secondary mission deck, or less if you already have cards remaining from the previous turn. Once you complete them, you discard them, and you have a couple opportunities to discard them otherwise if you don't like the ones that you get. Once per game, you can use the new order stratagem for 1 command point to discard one at the end of your command phase. Importantly, that's after you have gone through all your command phase stuff, so things like Battle Shock and things like that will complete before you get to use new orders. You'll discard one of your active tactical missions, and you will draw a new one from the deck. Alternatively, at the end of your turn, you can gain a command point by discarding one of your active tactical secondaries, but that does not refresh until your next command phase. So which of the two should you choose when you've come to the table and you don't know whether to pick your fixed missions or play tactical missions? And I'll preface this by saying that the rule of thumb is pretty easy. You should almost always, and especially as someone who's relatively new to the format and may not have a very specific strategy in mind, almost 100% of the time choose tactical missions. But you do need to adapt your list a little bit to succeed with them and score the maximum possible. But generally speaking, tactical missions give you a little bit of CP regen by discarding tactical missions you can't complete. You have a little bit of hand manipulation, so you don't really get trapped within them with the mechanics that we talked about earlier, and they score a little bit more easily and are more difficult for your opponent to counter from a turn-by-turn basis. So that's a pretty terse answer, but there are situations in which you should choose fixed missions, so let's talk about that first. Basically, in order for fixed missions to be a good choice for your game of Warhammer 40k, you need a solid plan to score each of them consistently. I would say you should probably be confident in scoring at least 15 or more victory points on each of your 2 missions for a total of 30 points out of the possible 40 in order to consider making that selection. Sometimes you get some free rolls. Things like Assassinate or Bring It Down are very good in very specific matchups. Things like Imperial or Chaos Knights give up Bring It Down a lot, and Assassination in some matchups like Genestealer Cults or matchups where your opponent has a ton of characters that are very aggressive, you can get very easily. And in some situations, your opponent's spammed Big Knights and War Dog Stalkers, and you can actually score both of them at the same time, which is pretty nuts. These can score extremely highly and do make your fixed mission selections a little bit easier if your opponent gives up a lot of points on them and you feel like you can kill the majority of their army. So being able to take one or both of these takes a lot of pressure off your fixed mission selection. They're about as close to passive mission scoring as you get in 10th edition, since killing units is going to happen naturally over the course of the game, so you don't really have to change your game plan significantly in order to grab these. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb when it comes to scoring these fixed missions consistently. If it's something that would normally fit into your game plan and you don't really have to adjust your game plan too much from what you would normally be doing, then they're a pretty good option. Now that said, for other choices, you will most likely need to incorporate specific strategies into your list. Secondaries such as deploy teleport homers, which you can score by completing an action in the middle of the table or your opponent's deployment zone, can be relatively consistent, but only if you've included enough action-performing utility units to do so. Those are usually throwaway units that you don't feel bad about chucking into the meat grinder and taking a turn off with in order to score you your victory points. Similarly, having lots of fast throwaway units like light vehicles, deep striking units, or double moving units like shadow specters allows you to plan for maneuver-style secondary missions like engage on all fronts pretty easily. So some specific examples of factions that can incorporate these maneuver-style secondary game plans into their plan are Tyranids, which can score them extremely easily by spawning spore mines from biovores wherever on the battlefield they need them to be outside 9 inches of enemy models, and performing actions or scoring those maneuver secondaries with those models. Grey Knights as well can consistently deep strike almost every turn of the game to continuously recycle models and keep using their stratagem to put them 3 inches outside enemies to get them anywhere they need to on the table. Now that said, there are also a few secondaries that look relatively easy but kind of are a trap and get very difficult to complete. I see these taken a lot by players who are relatively new and unfortunately punished pretty significantly for their selection. These include Storm Hostile Objective, which not only takes the first round of scoring off, you can't even score it on the first round, but also your opponent can play around it by not controlling objectives or just contesting them with you so you don't have an opportunity to take them back and score your 5 victory points. Cleanse is another one, which requires 2 of your units to go to objectives in no man's land and then take the entire turn off, which, while some armies may have enough spare units to do this, it is very difficult and it's a huge amount of resources to contribute every single turn in order to complete it, and you need to be completing it on at least 2 objectives every turn in order to max a secondary, which is a huge investment. So if you have a pre-built plan for the secondaries that are relatively easy, and or you have a matchup that's conducive to a specific fixed objective, then I'd consider it an option. But like I said at the top, in every other case, I default to taking tactical missions. So let's talk about the best ways to score those. Now I'll do a video on some tips and tactics for army list building and some of the units that you should be including in a well-balanced 40k army. But one of those are utility units. And like I mentioned before, these are throwaway units that you don't really feel bad about losing in exchange for raw victory points. And in order to secure your game plan using tactical missions, you will need a lot of these, just because you need to be able to remain flexible and have units that you can move out to score secondaries when you draw them. I'd recommend having at least 2 or 3 of these units that you can sort of play aggressively with, and even if your opponent kills them, it's not going to be the end of the world. And I'd give a special emphasis to scout or infiltrating units that can score you cards on the first 1 to 2 rounds of the game, when the rest of your army might not be in range of middle objectives. Now, when you draw your tactical mission cards, they represent one of the most limited but valuable resources in the entire game of Warhammer 40k, and that is just the opportunity to score victory points. And wasting them by discarding them without having scored them is the easiest way to get outscored by your opponent. So for this reason, using your forward operators like your infiltrators and scouts we discussed earlier aggressively with the ability to score aggressive mid-board secondaries like secure no man's land, cleanse, extend battle lines, or deploy teleport homers, and your backline units staying back in order to perform investigate signals or defend stronghold when you draw those cards as soon as the game begins, gives you the best option to clear those cards from your hand as early as possible, as quickly as possible. A lot of these cards can be cleared for a very low value as well. Things like cleanse or investigate signals can be completed with just a single action, but don't get you the maximum number of points. And that said, you should not be afraid to complete these secondaries for less than the maximum number of points than you could get with them, since once you complete them, they leave your hand immediately and you get the opportunity to draw a new card the next turn. So while you could hold out to score 5 victory points on Cleanse, you could also complete it immediately that turn, score your 3 victory points, and gain a new card that you can potentially score even more points on. Ultimately, the immediate victory points and chance for a good new card draw is worth much more than keeping the card stuck in your hand and waiting until the next turn. Likewise, you should not be afraid to sacrifice some of your damage output in order to score your secondary missions. Especially medium-sized units like infantry squads with heavy weapons or medium-sized tanks, you should not be afraid to give up their shooting in order to move to objectives that you need to score for victory points or complete mission actions. A couple of las cannon shots from a tank or an infantry squad is a lot less value in the grand scheme of things than immediately getting victory points right then and there. So even while you have utility units in your army, and those units are the ones that you want to be completing secondary missions with, while you use your combat units to jockey for position or get shots on enemy models, those are not the only units that can score those missions. If you have a unit in position to score the mission right now, unless that is a mainstay of your army that needs to be in a specific position or is an expensive unit like a Titan or a big heavy tank that you really need to be dealing damage to your opponent's models, then it's almost always the correct play to use it to complete your secondary mission as quickly as you can. Lastly, flexibility is the name of the game when it comes to tactical missions. When you have a variety of objectives that are going to be dealt to you, don't hesitate to use mechanics like strategic reserves or deep strikes with the intent of keeping your units for secondary draws in the mid-game that you might not be ready for. A unit deep striking or strategic reserving versus deploying in your deployment zone effectively gives them unlimited movement to show up wherever you need to. So keeping a couple of your units in reserve for an inopportune draw of engage on all fronts or behind enemy lines. And oftentimes you'll find players including small squads that have the deep strike keyword solely for the fact that you can use them to complete those secondaries. These more expensive but oftentimes more flexible utility units are incredibly powerful at making sure that those secondaries leave your hand as quickly as possible. Now, the last question that I'm sure you have that I want to answer is, when should you discard objectives when you haven't scored them, either using the New Order stratagem or at the end of your turn for command point gain? While you can use the tactical missions as a way to generate command points, I would not recommend this as your primary command point economy. And while it does feel bad to already have gained command points earlier in the turn and then not be able to actually gain the CP by discarding the card at the end of the turn and just discarding it for no value at all, it does feel bad. You should not be afraid to do so. Now, I don't think that there's like a catch-all answer for which secondaries you should keep versus which secondaries you should discard, but I do think that at the end of your turn, the consideration should be made of whether or not you can score the secondaries that you have within the next battle round. And if you can't, I would consider discarding those. I'm also a proponent of using new orders earlier rather than later. So if you grab a really bad secondary early, I would use new orders on it as quickly as I can in order to give you the opportunity to draw a better card early on in the game. That can cycle that bad card through your hand more quickly and give you more opportunities to draw more cards as the game goes on. You'll also find that objectives naturally become easier to score in the later game. So if you draw a secondary on the first turn of the game that's almost impossible for the next 2 to 3 battle rounds, getting rid of that immediately is going to be the best value for you, since you'll be able to complete more difficult secondaries later on as your army naturally spreads out over the table and starts grabbing objectives, moving to different table quarters, and threatening your opponent's deployment zone. The more that you cycle inopportune secondaries out of your hand and complete secondaries as quickly as possible will give you the more opportunity to draw new cards and then score more victory points. And I think as you sort of adopt this style of play, you'll find that the number of secondary points you score over the course of the game starts to go up and up. While it is possible to draw a handful of really bad cards, I think good players will find that good armies that are well composed to score secondaries as quickly as possible, give themselves the best chance to draw the best hands that they can, and end up completing secondary missions much faster than players who aren't prepared for it. Now, obviously, this is all based on personal experience, and if you have any personal experience and tips and tricks when it comes to completing tactical secondary missions, let me know down in the comment section below. But with that, that is going to be all of the advice that I have for you today. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.